Welcome back to Alex Gordon Audios. Last time, Cain secured the safety of Lucia van Yesterbal by sending her back to Slaukenberg with Zariah, narrowly avoided a disastrous misunderstanding with his chief clerk, and plunged headlong into the warp storms in pursuit of the Brotherhood of Darkness and their stolen Shadowlight relic. Now, 3 weeks of nightmarish warp travel have pushed his fleet to the breaking point, until a familiar Harlequin appears with an impossible offer. Leirahaz promises a Webway route to their quarry, bypassing the deadly storms entirely, but accepting Xenos' aid comes with its own perils. As Cain's ships sail through the alien corridors of the Labyrinthine Dimension, every moment takes them closer to a final confrontation with Astyanath's lunatic word-bearers, and closer to discovering whether this alliance is salvation or trap. The die is cast, the Webway stretches ahead. Strap in for the longest chapter yet. Warmaster of Chaos, Part 33.
All in all, I must say that our departure from Torridon happened with surprising rapidity. We kept the details of the reason why speed was of the essence a secret, of course. I didn't want the Imperium to learn about the Shadowlight, as they would be just as enthusiastic about leaving it in our hands as I was leaving it in the Brotherhood's. But our people worked fast, and we were able to meet Arilu's deadline of 24 hours. The temporary farewells of Arilu and Lucia had been predictably emotional. Thankfully, Zariah had gotten attached to the younger Horn Psyker the moment she'd seen her, and the shock and excitement of getting a big sister, as Zariah had introduced herself, along with the prospect of moving outside of the world wounder and back on a planet, had been enough to prevent Lucia from throwing a tantrum with the potential to be as destructive as an amble in a porcelain shop. My daughter had carried Arilu's in her arms aboard the transport that would take them both back through the portal and to Slaukenberg, where they would be safe in the Liberation Palace. Or at least as safe as one could be while at the side of the progeny of the most dangerous weapon ever created by the Officio Assassinorum, surrounded by heretics and in the center of governance of a planetary regime that had rebelled against the Imperium and was ostensibly led by a black-hearted warlord who'd murdered the Inquisitor, trying to bring it back within the master of mankind's embrace. But considering Segmentum High Command had been willing to let the entire Torridon subsector, which had provided considerably better tithes than a single petty vacation world, go, the chances of an Imperial Reclamation Force going after Slaukenberg in the short term were minimal, at least so long as we didn't do anything that drew attention from the powers that be. The only truly nerve-wracking moment had been when Jafar had cornered me in my office and congratulated me on smoothly securing a hostage to ensure Lady Van Yasterbal's loyalty. Fortunately, he had been smart enough to do so out of earshot of anyone else other than Jürgen and Militia. But once I'd suppressed my initial surge of horrified panic, I had made damn sure to explain to the fool that such wasn't my intent, and that if anything happened to Lucia in my absence, I would throw his bloody, skinned carcass to Arilu as an apology. I may have been running out of patience and sleep, as I'd been asleep since our arrival in the system by that point. But he seemed to have got the message at least, so I wouldn't return home to some kind of idiotic scheme the chief clerk thought he was running in my name, and which would end with the world wounder raising Slaukenberg from orbit. After being told what the Shadowlight was, and the danger it represented in the hands of a band of lunatics like the Brotherhood of Darkness, Althea had insisted on accompanying us, along with a cadre of her elite warriors. She'd argued, quite reasonably, that the Brotherhood was certain to come for her people at some point. Apparently, the Beastkin had a long history of being courted by rebels and heretics to very limited success, a fact that no doubt had a lot to do with their continued existence as citizens of the Imperium. With all that done, our 4 ships set into motion toward the system's Mandeville point. Even with the sightless godling destroyed, the remaining ships of the Brotherhood of Darkness were still enough to pose a threat to the World Wounder on its own. So, although it was likely going to make our pursuit even more difficult than it already was going to be, we had no choice but to use the same technique as before. A circle of magi aboard every ship of our small fleet was sorcerously keeping in touch with each other in order for the ships to remain together in the warp. In addition, Harold and Christabel had set up a different tracking ritual using a piece of armor they'd gotten off one of the Chaos Marines who had tried to kill them, the one Tarek had stabbed through the eye with his own weapon. Apparently, the manner of the transhuman's demise lent it some more spiritual weight to provide guidance to the navigator. Everything had seemed to be going well, and we were as prepared as we could, which I should have realized was a bad sign. Almost as soon as we'd entered the Immaterium to follow the trail of the Brotherhood's fleet, the journey had become the worst warp travel I'd ever experienced. According to Arilu's navigator, the Brotherhood had gone straight into the heart of the warp storms, which made sailing in the Torridon Gap such a nightmare, which, while clear evidence of the Chaos Marines' utter insanity, made following them considerably more difficult than I'd have preferred. The World Wounder shook and heaved as tides of warp energy smashed against its Geller field, causing nightmares and worse across the entire crew. There hadn't been any more demonic incursions on the rogue trader vessel, like the one that had ended with me dueling Skulltaker, thank the gods. But according to what scant telepathic communication we could manage with the rest of the fleet, they weren't so lucky. The last laugh, for instance, had been briefly haunted by a manifestation of its previous captain, which had terrorized the lower decks for 3 days straight before a team of USA troopers supported by Tenshin Magi had cornered it in the waste processing section and banished it before it could complete its apparent plan to torture a dozen kidnapped crew members into insanity and hurl them into the great chemical vats. There were also a lot of more mechanical malfunctions, resulting to the strain this was putting on the engines. Eventually, after 3 weeks, Arilu was forced to order a collective exit from the warp in order to repair the damage to several key systems of our accompanying ships. We emerged in the middle of the void, light years away from the nearest star. I do not mind admitting that the sight of the blackness through the oculus shook me, and I gladly took refuge in my quarters, throwing myself into the paperwork that had caught up with me now that I was outside of the Immaterium and back in range, so to speak, of the Ansible network. I was reading through the reports that had arrived through the Ansible network, both from the rest of the fleet and from the rest of the Protectorate, when a call arrived on my personal Vox line. I raised an eyebrow when I saw from the ident rune that the call was from Tarek. The Beastkin prophet had still been recovering when the World Wounder had left Torridon. Even with the panacea, Fighting a space marine took a lot out of someone, and Tarek, for all his qualities as a religious leader, hadn't actually fought anyone before stabbing the Dark Brother to death with his own knife. In the middle of the preparations for the pursuit, nobody had thought that maybe he should be sent back to Torridon, Minoris I, with a bunch of panacea and clear instructions for his care to the beastkin. Instead, he had woken up with the World Wounder already in the warp, and by that point it was too late. I felt sorry for the poor bastard, although he had taken it remarkably well. That, or the shock and realization of just how much danger he was in, hadn't really hit him yet at the time. Wondering why he was calling me, I opened the link, already feeling the palms of my hands starting to tingle. Lord Cain. What is it, Tarek? I asked, wondering what new disaster was about to befall us. I was taking a walk through the ship when I found someone I'm pretty sure isn't supposed to be here, a colorful gentleman who said his name was Leirahaz and that he needed to talk to you. Does that sound like someone you know? I stared at the Vox speaker for several seconds, my brain struggling to process what I'd just heard. Eventually, I managed to answer. Yes, it does. Please escort him to the bridge at once, Sieur Tarek. Be extremely polite. He's an Eldar underneath that ridiculous costume. Oh, the same as Lady Militia ? Not quite as lethal, at least as far as I knew. But Militia was within earshot and listening in with wide eyes, so I wasn't going to say anything that might seem to imply the opposite, but still very dangerous. However, he wasn't hostile the last time we met, and I would rather keep it that way. As do I. Very well. I'll guide him to the bridge at once. I will meet you there. The Vox call ended, leaving me to marvel at the extent of Tarek's prophetic abilities. Harlequins were, according to Militia, legendarily difficult to catch when they were trying to sneak into places, yet the Beastkin prophet had managed it seemingly on accident. I pressed another rune, opening a link to the bridge. Arilu? It's Ciaphas. I have some urgent if perplexing news. Moments later, I was standing on the bridge, along with my retinue and a score of Van Yastabal household guards, as Tarek escorted a familiar figure onto the bridge, looking distinctly unhappy to be here. Leirahaz looked exactly like I remembered him from our brief but memorable encounter over 16 years ago, with his colorful outfit, no doubt concealing all manner of weapons and alien technology. The bridge crew were sneaking nervous glances in his direction, and the household guards were holding their weapons tightly, even on a rogue trader ship, and one with as unorthodox as Arilu as its lady captain, shall we say. It wasn't every day you had a Xenos on the bridge. Well, except for Militia, I suppose. But my Bloodwood hadn't exactly caused people to be more comfortable around her kind. Greetings, Lord Liberator, the clown called out to me with an overly elaborate bow. Leirahaz of the Veiled Path, I replied neutrally. It has been some time since our last meeting. Indeed it has. I trust you have been well. Certainly the Protectorate has prospered greatly since then. Indeed it has. I repeated his own words back at him, before deciding to forego subtlety entirely. Why are you here, Harlequin? Because it seems that you and your allies are in something of a predicament. The Brotherhood of Darkness have knowledge of hidden paths through the Sea of Souls and access to vile rituals and pacts that allow their ships to sail through the violent storms that plague this region of space. You, however, do not. You could, but I do not believe that you will. However, that is precisely why I am here. He struck a pose that, by all rights, should have looked ridiculous, but instead managed to come out as regal and continued. You see, my friends, there is a Webway gate leading to the system where the sons of Lorgar you now hunt have made their lair. Long has it lain dormant, hidden from detection by the Dark Apostle and his minions. But it could be reactivated under the right circumstances. Circumstances such as these, where time is of the essence. Militia, I asked, not removing my gaze from Leirahaz. Is he right? I have no idea whether there's a Webway gate to our destination, but it is possible. And it isn't unheard of for human vessels to go through the Webway. My bloodwood shrugged. Back before Vex Rise, the Astartes you call salamanders sailed all the way to the Dark City itself in order to free one of their ships. If they could navigate it without a guide, then this ship should be able to do so with the Harlequin's help. That wasn't quite the ringing endorsement I'd been hoping for, but since the alternatives were to keep hurling the World Wounder into the warp storm and hope that things would go differently this time, or giving up on this mad quest and wait for the Brotherhood either returned with a legion of psykers or broke the galaxy in half by dabbling with the shadow light, I didn't have much choice. Still, that doesn't answer the most pressing question. Why are you helping us, Harlequin? Asked Militia, her hands casually resting on her weapons. Because, oh Dark One, replied the Harlequin, with shocking clarity and seriousness. The Brotherhood cannot be allowed to keep the shadow light. In their hands, that relic will be used to unleash unspeakable horror upon the galaxy. They must be stopped, and that which they have stolen must be taken from their grasp. There was a chorus of whispers from the bridge crew, and I frowned. We'd kept the theft of the shadow light as much of a secret from the Protectorate at large as possible, but it was a well-known fact among the World Wounder's elite to learn that the artifact was so important that it would make even the legendarily aloof Eldar take note and intervene. Unless, of course, this was a trap, and Leirahaz was going to lead us to our doom. But I remembered the reports I read on the damage to the ships from trying to follow the Brotherhood into the storms. The simple truth was we couldn't follow them directly, not without me letting the Magi delve into the kind of rituals I'd prescribed since the uprising, and for very good reasons. Very well, I said. Show us this path, Leirahaz. Arilu and the others accepted my decision, mostly because of the lack of alternatives, I suspect. Leirahaz told the location of the Webway gate on the star map to the navigator, and a course was immediately set. Though the immaterium was still tumultuous to say the least, it was obvious even to me that we weren't running headfirst against the currents as we had done before. Within a couple of days of the Harlequin's arrival, we emerged from the warp into a nearly empty star system, devoid of anything in the World Wounder's records save for a meaningless strings of letters and numbers attributed to it by the earliest space explorers of old Earth, back when the Emperor was in nappies. The only feature of interest in the system orbited the small, guttering star at such a large distance it could barely be considered part of the system at all. With Leirahaz's guidance, Ever since Tarek had escorted him to the bridge, he'd stayed there, under heavy guard at all times, but hadn't made a single hostile move, nor had he asked for food or water. The Auspex systems were able to find and lock onto it, and soon we were approaching a ring of some unknown material. The scans were unable to identify its composition, and not even Leirahaz or militia knew what it was made from, claiming it was a construct of those who came before, like the rest of the Webway. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, but by this point, it was too late to change my mind. The inside of the ring was utterly impenetrable to our scans. According to Tessalon Kappa, who sounded dangerously fascinated, there was simply nothing there. Not the emptiness of space, which I have been told is still haunted by the background radiation of distant stars, but literally nothing at all. "That's normal," said Militia as the leader of the Borgs finished his report, their voice as excited as it was possible for it to get. A gateway of that size would have to lead to one of the quieter sections of the Webway. I nodded, pretending that made sense. "And we can just sail through it?" "Yes, Lord Liberator," said Leirahaz. "Once inside, however, your ships will need to remain within very close formation, and each ship will need to precisely follow the course of the one before it. While this great vessel will have to follow my instructions precisely, the Webway is a complex place to navigate. Without me to lead you, you could wander for an eternity and never find an exit." "I see," I said. "Very well. Arelu, how much time does the fleet need to run final checks, repairs after our latest trip through the warp, that sort of thing?" "Give us 10 hours, and we'll be ready for whatever the Webway can throw at us," replied the rogue trader confidently. I didn't quite share her certainty, but this was her ship. "Then we'll do that. I'll be in my quarters getting some rest. I suggest you find the time to do the same, Arelu," I said, standing up from my observation chair and beginning to walk toward the bridge's door before pausing theatrically. "Oh, and Leirahaz?" "Yes, Liberator?" he asked, with what I was fairly certain was a non-negligible amount of cheek in his tone. "If this is a trap, I will not rest until I have personally fed your soul to Emily," I said conversationally. This deep into the warp storms, the eldritch connection between me and the demon princess I had unwittingly helped ascend was frayed and thinned, so me speaking her name didn't result in any obvious supernatural manifestations. Still, looking into the reflection on the polished brass panels around the door, I saw the Harlequin froze for a moment, and I silently patted myself on the back for finally getting past his infuriating composure. "I will keep that in mind, Lord Liberator," he said, a lot more subdued than before. A few moments later, once I was back in my quarters, Jürgen handed me a cup of freshly brewed recaf and asked me, "Was that wise, sir?" Threatening the clown, I mean ? A rather pertinent question, I'm sure you will agree. In fact, given that Militia had nodded in agreement when Leirahaz had said we would be in great peril should we get lost in the Webway, antagonizing our only guide might be considered a very bad idea. Unfortunately, it had been clear to me that nobody on board was feeling especially happy about following his plan, and I didn't want the heretics around me to start thinking I could be manipulated by an alien in a colorful suit, even if that was absolutely what was happening. My threat had been meant to reassure them that I was still in control, merely taking advantage of an unexpected windfall, instead of flailing about like a scabby thrown into the sump and clinging to the first bit of buoyant garbage in reach. But I couldn't say that to Jürgen, lest the image of me he'd constructed in his head be irrevocably shattered. Fortunately, I'd suspected he, or someone else, would ask me that question and come up with an acceptable justification. Whatever his reasons for helping us, it's clear he's playing a game of some kind and using us as pawns, I explained. Even if it plays to our advantage, it's not something I'm particularly comfortable with, and I'd rather keep it that way for him as well, so that he doesn't get any ideas. Harlequins are always playing a game, Militia cut in. I still don't know why that one interfered when you had that Inquisitor in custody to get her and the Panacea released to the Imperium. But stealing Lady Mali's copy without anyone noticing cannot have been easy. The Laughing God has taken an interest in you, Cain. Wonderful, I sighed. He can get in line behind all the others. Although, thinking about it, having the Eldar divine equivalent of a court jester interested in my life probably explained a lot of things. 10 hours later on the dot, I was back on the bridge, watching with growing anxiety as the portal to the Webway became larger and larger on the viewport. The World Wounder would go first, and the rest of our flotilla would follow one by one, with enough time between each passage to hopefully prevent collisions regardless of conditions on the other side. Entering the Webway in 5, 4, 3, a bridge officer counted down, his voice broadcast all across the ship. 2, 1, now. I braced myself, instinctively expecting something similar to the gut-wrenching sensation that accompanies every jump to or out of the warp. Instead, the transition was impossibly smooth, which somehow made it all the more jarring. The rest of the bridge crew was just as surprised as I was, despite being far more used to void travel than me. However, Arilu was quick to re-establish discipline, her authority enough to push down the disquiet and fears of the bridge crew. She made a short speech that was broadcast not just across the decks of the World Wounder, but to the rest of the fleet as well, and I added a few words of my own at the end to tack on my authority and fraudulent reputation to her assurances that we would overcome this new challenge like we had overcome everyone before, through the strength of our unity and common purpose. It was all utter drivel, but the rogue trader's crew ate it up just as easily as the Slaukenberg natives always did. Regardless, the morale boost was welcome, as being in the Webway was incredibly unsettling. I wouldn't claim to have gotten used to warp travel. Truth be told, I believe anyone who tells you they have gotten used to sailing through the sea of souls is someone you should keep a wary eye on. But I had at least become more or less familiar with its perils and horrors. The best thing I can say about our journey through the Webway is that no more demons tried to kill me. Sleeping was hard because nobody could dream. Over the course of the trip, there were several incidents of crew members having mental breakdowns that, for once, hadn't been caused by demonic whispers from the warp, but good old-fashioned psychosis from the change in the environment compared to what the veteran sailors were used to. The Webway was especially harsh on psykers. Though Jurgen kept up a facade of calm with admirable aplomb, I knew my aide well enough to realize the strain being so removed from the rest of the galaxy was putting on him. Since I had grown so reliant on his services for a number of things, I did what I could to lessen his workload while inside the Webway, borrowing a couple of servants from Arelu to assist him in his duties. The utter emptiness we'd first encountered turned out to be a feature of only some of the Webway, which I eventually learned from Arelu during one of our regular evenings together, was also called the Labyrinthine Dimension, a name which was certainly apt, if a touch melodramatic. As we continued our journey, we passed by many strange and alien sights. Another change was that we could use the Vox to communicate with the other 3 ships of our flotilla. Their crews were equally spooked, but compared to the nightmare our odyssey through the warp had been before, it was still a marked improvement. The Ansible network didn't work while inside the Webway, though, which apparently had implications that puzzled and fascinated the Borgs in equal measure. Tessel and Kappa had gathered a bunch of their peers to study the phenomenon, but given that even the Eldar had forgotten more about the Webway than they remembered, I wasn't too worried that the Borgs would drop another incredibly valuable and dangerous discovery in my lab. Instead, it was Basileus-Zeta who contacted me 1 week into our journey through the blackness, telling me that he had completed his analysis of the Brotherhood corpses which had been left on the World Wounder and was ready to present his findings to me. Looking at the corpses of transhuman killing machines wasn't exactly my idea of a nice afternoon, but it was something to do, and any intelligence on the enemy we expected to face at the end of this journey could only be useful. I took Hektor with me to the Borg's laboratory, along with Jurgen and Militia. He was the closest thing I had to an expert on Astartes, and Sucha was understandably sticking to Arelu's side, as long as Leirahaz was on board. The name didn't fit him much anymore, now that the frankly absurd amount of panacea he'd injected into his system to keep himself alive had removed his facial scars. Only Hektor himself had been subjected to a greater injection on account of the state in which the USA had found him outside Skitterfall. But he still refused to elaborate on his past before being found by Arelu, so he was still Sucha to everyone else. Hektor insisted that there was something familiar about the other warrior's face, but despite his eidetic memory, he couldn't remember it, blaming it on the damage the butcher's nails had done to his brain. The corpses had been stripped of their armor and laid down on examination slabs in one of the World Wounder's morgues, a ship the size of a floating island. City had several by necessity, even if most bodies inevitably ended up either burned in the furnaces or recycled in some fashion I chose not to think about. Even without their armor and cut open, the Chaos Marines still seemed to radiate malevolence and threat. I've completed my examination of the Astartes armor and sent my notes to the rest of the fleet, the Borg began. After testing, the basic less weaponry of the USA should be able to inflict damage so long as it is set at maximum intensity. That'll burn through the power pack fast, I noted. General Malone told me he'd make sure the troops were aware of that fact. Basileus-Zeta assured me. I'm sure he did, but getting used to having less shots than before is still something that takes time. Hopefully, the training course they've been running during the journey will be enough to keep them from making fatal mistakes. I could all too easily imagine a USA trooper opening fire on a Chaos Marine, thinking they still had a few shots left in their weapon, only for their last rifle to be dry, and the inevitable outcome. Sure, the model of last rifle used by the USA had a display indicating how much of the power pack was left, but every soldier worth the name got used to counting the shots left in his head to avoid wasting time checking in the middle of a firefight, where even a single second's distraction could mean the difference between life and death. Moving on from their armor to what lies underneath, Basileus-Zeta continued. The Astartes of the Brotherhood of Darkness show a rather low mutation rate compared to the tales Sieur Hektor shared of warbands who have spent the past few millennia in the Eye of Terror. Their ship had tentacles and flights of demons roosting on its hull, I pointed out, remembering the after-action reports I'd read of the Void battle in Torridon. That doesn't strike me as something that happens without prolonged exposure to the warp. Yes, that contradiction puzzled me as well. Basileus-Zeta nodded, sounding happy I was paying attention. But then, Sieur Hektor provided me the answer. Really? I turned toward the former World Eater. And what was it? The word-bearers don't use Geller fields on their ships, he replied, blunt as a chain axe to the face. Still, it took me a few moments to process his words. So utterly deranged did they sound. I'm sorry? I eventually managed to say. I know. He shrugged, his armor struggling to mimic the motion. Completely fracking crazy, but it's true. They think it brings them closer to the gods. This, I began, before taking a deep breath. This explains so much about the Brotherhood's behavior. It does, doesn't it? Said Hektor, amused. They may not have the nails messing with their brains, but religion will mess you up too, and no mistake. That's not religion. I shook my head. I had to believe that, for the sake of what little sanity I'd managed to cling to in the years since my arrival on Slaukenberg. That's sheer, utter stupidity masquerading as religion. So their ship has been exposed to the immaterium whenever they traveled through the warp. But whatever crazy rituals they used to keep themselves from being ripped apart by demons also kept the mutagenic energies of the warp at bay. That seems unlikely. Well, the word-bearers believe that mutations are the way the gods shape us into our true selves, mused Hektor. So maybe the gods just think that the Brotherhood are boring. We all considered that silently for a moment, then, by silent agreement, decided to move on. There were subjects you just had to recognize were just poor conversation topics that wouldn't lead anywhere good. Despite the additional frills and aesthetic differences, the equipment of the Brotherhood also appears standard compared to what Sieur Hektor told. As for the Space Marine legions of the Great Crusade, the Borg continued, gesturing to a table where an assortment of Astartes-sized weaponry was put on display. I frowned, struck by a sudden thought. Hektor, I said, nodding toward the war gear, do you want to take this opportunity to change your weapons? With some cleaning and maintenance, these should be usable. Hektor hesitated, which wasn't an expression the face of a Space Marine was really suited to. I'm not sure using weapons that belong to the Brotherhood is a good idea, he confessed. I've scavenged pieces of equipment from Astartes corpses before. Gods know it wasn't like the Ravagers had a proper supply chain. For the longest time, the only way to replace broken war gear was to take it from the dead, whether they were the enemy or not. But this is different. Margos, I told Basileus-Zeta. With these weapons to serve as a reference, how soon could your brethren build something better suited to Hektor's physiology, even better than what you already built for him, I mean? The tech priests of the Van Yastobal dynasty have some experience working with Astartes weaponry as part of their mistress association with Sur Suture, but that experience is limited to maintaining existing warplate, not constructing entirely new ones. With these specimens to study, however, he made a noise that, in someone with an entirely natural body, would probably have been a click of the tongue. Not in time for any military operation in this campaign, I don't think. That's fine, said Hektor, patting the shoulder pauldron of the armor the Borgs had constructed for him by scaling up the power armor of the USA troopers. I've gotten used to this model anyway. Do you think it will hold up against their bolters, though? I asked, concerned, and rightfully so, since the armor I wore into battle was based on the same design as Hektor's, if significantly thicker in the case of the Liberator armor. Nothing can really hold up against a true Astartes bolter. That was the point of the weapon back in the Great Crusade. The transhuman shrugged. Even with the panacea and the advantage in numbers, there's no question that the USA will take losses against the Brotherhood. That wasn't what I wanted to hear. But underestimating one's foe was one of the easiest ways to die on the battlefield. Besides, considering how hideously resources-consuming even the ordinary bolt shells for the overwrought piece of frack that propaganda forced me to lug around were, I could only imagine that the larger ones employed by Space Marine bolters were even more so, in which case, them being far more dangerous than the humble lasgun made a lot of sense. Otherwise, what would have been the point of mass-producing them for the Emperor's Angels of Death, first during the Great Crusade, and then the 10,000 years that had followed? Intimidation alone couldn't possibly make up for the incredible expense compared to, say, building bigger lasguns, like the one the Borgs had made for Hektor. Not that I had ever seen him use it, mind you. Even with his cortical implants silenced by the panacea, Hektor still very much preferred to fight his enemies in melee combat. What strategy would you suggest? I asked the former Ravager. Go after the witches first, he replied without hesitation. Lorgar's brood aren't as capable as the Thousand Sons when it comes to sorcery, but they can still bring forth some proper nightmarish stuff if given the chance. Astyanath did boast that he'd sent the Skulltaker after me. I nodded, my hand subconsciously moving to the hilt of the Slayer sword hanging from my belt before I forced it away. If we take them by surprise, and given the route we're taking, I'd wager we've good odds of that. They shouldn't have the time to summon a Neverborn of that caliber. But even if they do, we will win, said Hektor, with a smile that would have sent all but the bravest of men running away in terror, but which sheer habit had thankfully made me immune to. I wished I could share his confidence, but whatever psychological alterations went into creation of a Space Marine to convince them of their own invincibility had clearly been lost to the Imperium by the time the Schola Progenium had been created and started forging young children into obedient Imperial enforcers with a nigh absolute success rate, at least until I'd come along. which, considering the stories Hektor had told me of the Legion's questionable choices, was probably for the best, all things considered.